The Omega Speedmaster is iconic. Sometimes a little bit of an also-ran to the Rolex Daytona, but certainly much more available and still a very good watch. Now, the Omega Speedmaster has gone through several iterations over the years, and it's actually existed for quite some time. But it's always been an attractive watch, and there's certainly styling similarities over time with the Speedmaster. So let's talk about this iteration, the one I've got right here, the Speedmaster Day-Date, reference number 3523-3000. Now, the watch itself has a chronograph, day, date, and month complication. It's easy to use, and I'll get into how you use it in a bit. Now, this specific one I've got here is actually currently available for sale via auction. It's a full set with the box, outer box and inner box, warranty card, and instruction manual. I'll link to that below if you're interested in checking it out. But let's have a look at the watch and what exactly it is. So let's start with an unboxing such as it is. Now, the outer box of this is cardboard, much like it is with pretty much all watches, including pretty much all Omegas. Now, this particular one shows some wear, however, it holds together perfectly fine. The inner box is where you really see wear on some of the older Omegas. This particular one is red, and it has some of the red kind of fading off and shedding, which is not exactly great, but at least the inner box is there, although inner boxes do somewhat wear out on these. Now, this seems to be quite common, but of course it's something to bear in mind. Now, Omega has improved this in recent years, but many of the older watches have this problem. Now, the instruction manual is quite thick. I won't go through that in much detail, because really the watch is kind of self-explanatory. But it goes through all what you need to know, probably in excruciating detail and more detail than you really need, and in multiple languages. Now, inside the inner box, we of course have the watch, and the warranty cards are floating around in this whole package. Now, the inside of the inner box is, well, it's a box. There's not much to say about it, but you've got the watch in there, and the watch is nice. So let's talk about the watch itself, and I'll start off with the aesthetics before we go through how the watch actually functions. Now, the dial has a sunburst silver effect. If you look closely, it nicely disperses the light, so it has this shimmering type appearance to it. Now, elsewhere on the dial, we've got the Omega logo, which is slightly raised, and the lettering on it is quite pleasant. The dial has textural coherence, that is, everything kind of sits together in a nice manner, rather than just being kind of lumped there. Everything kind of works together. So we've got the main dial, and then we've got three inner dials, one of which contains the second hand. The other one is primarily devoted to the chronograph functions. Now, the main dial has several things on it. It of course has the hour and minute hand, but it has two other hands as well. It's got a chronograph hand, which is the thinner hand with the loom on it, and there's also a date hand, which is the hand with the crescent. The chronograph hand functions like we'd ordinarily do in a chronograph. The date one points toward the date, which is in the set of numbers in the outside of the dial, and it just circles around when you adjust the date. The bezel also has numbers, although I do suspect in many of these the bezel is not actually used for anything other than appearance. Now, the dial overall is very nice, and it is easy to read. This contrasts with some other chronographs and some other watches that I've seen where the dial is not very legible, and particularly given the sheer number of function on this, the hour, the minute, the seconds, and also the day and the date and the month, it's actually relatively easy to read. Now, of course, when you're buying a used one of these, do check the dial condition, because of course that's going to be important. Now, elsewhere on the watch, the case is stainless steel. Now, of course, in more recent Omegas, you can get them in gold, but this one is in steel. It isn't too much of a fingerprint magnet, but of course it is a little bit shiny in parts, and it can attract some smudges. Furthermore, the Speedmaster's bezel tends to show wear over time, so just bear that one in mind. Now, the case is standard Speedmaster shape. Now, of course, over time, these have come in different sizes. This particular one is 39mm in diameter, and I find it to be a good size, particularly when you factor in the fact that it's got a crown and the two pushes for the chronograph, so it actually wears a little bit bigger, particularly when you factor in the bracelet as well. Now, the case back is closed, and it has the Speedmaster logo on it, which is kind of raised, or kind of it stands out, which is rather nice. It has that little logo for the sea monster, which I think is rather attractive, but it's otherwise relatively normal for an Omega Speedmaster case. The bracelet is the standard Omega Speedmaster bracelet. I think it's attractive, because oftentimes with bracelets they end up being a little bit garish and gaudy and maybe too shiny and not very attractive. And I find that to be often the case with many of the more recent watches, not necessarily from Omega, but from some other brands. I find this bracelet to be quite attractive because it's interesting without being garish. It's also quite comfortable to wear, although the watch overall is a little bit on the heavier side. The clasp functions in an ordinary manner. You kind of push the buttons in, the clasp opens up, and you can then just close it as you ordinarily would. The clasp also has the Omega logo on it, which again is not terribly surprising. It's overall an attractive watch with an attractive bracelet. The technical specifications are of course somewhat interesting. It is, like I've said, a chronograph with day, month, and date complications. It reportedly has 50 meters of water resistance, although I do suspect that many people are not actually going to test this, and I won't be either. Now, it uses Omega's caliber 1151 movement, which it seems has been reasonably robust, and this one functions perfectly okay. And it's easy to operate, and everything functions quite smoothly. So for example, to change the time on this, you pull out the crown, and the crown is signed by the way, although it has some texturing on it. You pull it out to the time setting, and swivel it around, back and forth, like you ordinarily would to adjust the time. To change the date, well, that's a tiny bit more fiddly because you need to get the crown into the right location, but again, you swivel that to change the date. The date only goes in one direction, which can be a little bit annoying, because if you take the date too far, then you kind of need to circle all the way back around. But when you circle the date, you also can adjust the month, which means you ultimately end up having to go almost through a full year potentially in order to get to the date you want. I suspect that many people are going to find this so annoying to deal with, they won't actually ever bother to adjust the date. I probably wouldn't either. Now, it also is relatively easy to change the day as well, which you do by pushing the button on the top left-hand side of the case. You push in the button that just cycles through the days. It's relatively easy to use, but do bear in mind the annoyance with changing the date and the month. And I suspect the month on many of these is just going to remain wrong forever. The chronograph functions in the same ordinary manner as it would. Press the top button to start it going, press it again to stop it, press the bottom button to reset it. Pretty standard, but it functions smoothly. The watch overall, therefore, is very straightforward to use. I suspect that many people, including myself, would never use any of these complications, but it is nice to have. The chronograph might get a little bit more use than some of the other ones, but still, it's nice that these things exist. But the unnecessary complication of them might be why many of the more recent Omega Speedmasters don't actually have some of these things. But in any case, overall, I quite like the watch. I think it's attractive. I really like the dial. I think the dial is very nice with the sunburst type effect, particularly when you see it in person or in videos, and photos don't quite do it justice in my opinion. The bracelet is nice. I think it's an attractive watch, and I think it looks nice without standing out or looking gaudy or garish. It's also a good alternative if you either can't afford or can't buy something like a Rolex Daytona, which is probably what many of us are actually aspiring to own. Now, alternatives to this can be a little bit tricky to find, because the Omega Speedmaster Day-Date is quite attractive in terms of its price segment, and it's tough to find a good direct competitor. Now, some competitors might be the Breitling Super Ocean, or the Super Ocean Heritage, or the Navitimer. However, they're not direct analogs, because the Breitling Super Ocean is a very different style from the Omega Speedmaster. The Breitling Super Ocean Heritage kind of has a similar vibe in my opinion. I think the bracelet on the Super Ocean Heritage is much uglier than it is on the Omega Speedmaster. However, it's similar in terms of the dial as far as the vibe goes. However, it's often a little bit more expensive if you're going to go for the chronograph, for example. You can also look at some of the Zeniths, but I don't think they're a direct analog in my opinion. And I think the Omega Speedmaster is kind of a classic option that I'd probably take over many of the other alternatives. At least that's me anyway. Now this particular one, like I've said, is for sale, is available for auction at the moment, and I'll link to that in the description below, and I'll otherwise link to some alternatives if and when that sells. But otherwise, thanks a lot for tuning in. Give me your thoughts about the Omega Speedmaster in the comments below, and give me your thoughts about any alternatives to the Omega Speedmaster that you think that I should check out.